Okay, so we'll start with the class called the chitons of the mollusks, and I'm not going to give you a lot of details on these classes, just for hopefully you recognizing some of the basic differences, but the chitons are those kinds of mollusks that have 8 shells. So I don't know if you can see in these two photographs different species, but each one of these shells, and they have a foot on the bottom, and basically they attach to rocks in the ocean. I don't know that anybody eats chitons, humans, but they're part of the marine food chain. So that's all I'm going to say about the chitons. You know, they're a mollusk. They have 8 overlapping shells. You're good. Okay? For the gastropod group, remember, gastro means stomach, and pod or pod refers to the foot. So these are the stomach-footed mollusks. And so if we look at, well, the snail and this nudibranch, this colorful one here, these are both gastropods. And so the foot is on the bottom here for the snail. The foot is on the bottom here for the nudibranch. And right above that is the stomach. And so this is why they're called stomach-footed. So some of them do actually have shells, like this land snail. And of course you can see that the nudibranch, which is marine, is much more colorful. So I think I've said this before, that marine organisms usually are a little more colorful than some of the land ones. Okay, so you have a couple more pictures here, the land snail at the top and a nudibranch at the bottom. Sometimes the common name for nudibranchs are sea slugs. That's all I'm going to say about the gastropods. Okay, so we're being quite brief on these different classes, but I want you to recognize the name and what kind of organism you would find in that group. Okay, so remember, cephalo refers to head, so the cephalopods are the head-footed mollusks. Of all of the invertebrates, they're the smartest. They have a pretty big brain. They're fast. They can get pretty large. So you've probably heard of an octopus, and you've probably heard of a squid. And my picture is covering up one of those pictures just a little bit, but here's the octopus down here. And then I've also put a picture of a chambered nautilus. So this would be one that has a shell. The head is back here. You can see its eye, and then it's got tentacles up here, which would be considered the foot part. So I put 2 videos, one for if you've never seen a chambered nautilus before. It just kind of shows how it moves up and down in the water column. And then the octopus one shows how the octopus is using tools. And so indicating that it's a pretty smart organism. If you ever watched the, I think it would be the second movie, Not Finding Nemo, I forget what the second one was called, but there was an octopus, and he was pretty smart, and he could get himself into and out of things, and that's true of octopi in real life. And so the last group of the mollusks are the bivalves, and these are ones that have 2 shells, 2 valve shells. Okay, so you probably heard of clams. If you eat seafood, maybe you eat scallops. I usually bring all of these to class, but it's hard to show you these when we're doing this on PowerPoint. But this here is a scallop shell. Okay. And at the back, where the 2 shells are held together, there's a muscle that holds the 2 shells together. When you eat scallops, that's what you're eating, is that muscle. If you eat mussels, which is a delicacy especially in the Northeast, you are basically eating the entire organism. So they cook the whole mussel, which is a type of bivalve or clam, and then you eat the whole thing. This one here is just to indicate we've got some diversity. So this is a very large clam. It's sitting on the back side. It's probably about 5 feet tall, and you would find those on different coral reefs. Okay, so I did load a video here, because if you haven't watched this happen, if you haven't been to the beach and watched this happen on the sand when the waves come up, you can kind of see how clams are actually able to burrow themselves under the sand. So this is a real short video to show you how that works, but basically they stick the foot out and then just start to move, contract the foot to pull themselves under, and then on the other end of the shell is a siphon, and they put that siphon up so that they can still get air. And so sometimes when the waves go down and you see bubbles under the sand, that's because the siphons are sticking up and they're pulling in oxygen. So some different pictures. I think these pictures are from the McGraw-Hill book, but you can see the chitin at the top. This one here is a scallop. You have a land snail here. A land slug is basically a snail without a shell, and then an octopus and a squid. So we've talked about all the different examples, but there are certain ones in this group that if you eat seafood, you might eat. So you may eat clams, you may eat mussels, you may eat scallops, and those are some of the pictures that I have here to illustrate. Okay, so the next big phylum is the phylum Annelida or Annelida, depending on who you are. But it is, what is unique to this is that these are the worms that have segments. So we talked about steps up as we start to look at these organisms and what other either adaptations or characteristics they have. So these worms are segmented, which means that they can be more specialized. In the case of the earthworm, which is an example, all the segments are pretty much the same. We still have bilateral symmetry, which is the highest level of symmetry. But one of the big steps here is that we have a circulatory system that is closed. So all the blood is within either the heart or the vessels. There's no blood sloshing around. On this diagram, and different diagrams show it differently, they call these red, larger vessels, dorsal blood vessels. There are books that call those hearts because it's a vessel that's quite large and muscular, and so it actually is able to contract to move the blood around. And then you can see that we have vessels going all the way along to the whole body of the worm, okay? So you have a couple of pictures here. They're calling them aortic arches. So it's a blood vessel, but it's a very muscular blood vessel. So most of you probably are familiar with earthworms, and maybe you're also familiar with leeches. Leeches are also segmented worms. This is showing how the leech attaches. So it has an anterior, meaning a front sucker, and it also produces an anesthetic. So the leech can attach to you, attach to your skin. It will inject anesthetic so that you don't feel it, and then it's going to suck blood. Okay, so that's how it survives. And so you notice on this picture here that the leech is attached to somebody who has just finished surgery and they're having some swelling. So there are medicinal leeches that are actually used to bring down inflammation. They're cleaned and all of that kind of stuff, but they're actually used in medicine. Just as an example, when my kids were pretty little, we used to go out to East Texas and, you know, go camping and hiking in the woods and all that kind of stuff. And my youngest son, who was probably about 3 on this particular time, we're hiking in the woods. We walked across a stream. We come across the other side, and I looked down. He just had sandals on, and it looked like he had a leaf on his foot. So I bent down to pull it off and realized that it was a leech. And so I told the older kids, I said, distract him, just talk to him or something for a minute while I take this off. And as soon as I pulled the leech off, because it had an anesthetic, but it also produces anticoagulant so that the blood will flow. It just started bleeding like crazy. And so you just have to, you know, put some pressure on it until you start to get clotting. And he was totally fine. He didn't feel anything because of the anesthetic. But when he looked down and saw blood all over his foot, he started really screaming. So sometimes blood can elicit that reaction even if you're not having any pain. And the leech is able to both anesthetize where it's going to cut and then cause the blood not to coagulate, so it's going to be much easier for it to remove that blood from your system. And these are a couple of examples of marine annelids. Again, annelids are segmented worms. You can see the segments, but you can also see that they're much more colorful and a little bit more interesting looking than maybe an earthworm or a leech. Oh, I don't think I can go back, and it just skipped that picture, but what was indicated on that picture was the leech can start out pretty thin, and you're going to see it get bigger and bigger as it sucks your blood, and then it lets go until it can digest that meal, and then it would attach for another meal. Okay, so we have gone through several different phyla of invertebrate organisms. And so we are now to the roundworms, and roundworms are not segmented. They're put at this group because of the way the internal tissues are organized, and I'm not going to be that specific with you guys, but I do want you to know that they have complete digestion, so they have an opening at the beginning and at the end. They're not segmented. They do have a cuticle on the outside because some of these roundworms might live inside a human system, and then it would not want to be digested. Okay, so Ascaris is a human parasite roundworm. Not so common in this country, but in some other countries maybe a little bit more common. So there are, you know, just free-living scavenger roundworms that you might find in pond water or in soil. If you took 1408 with us, and we did pond water for learning to use the microscope, I had a lot of students who found little roundworms in the pond water, and they're not parasitic, they're just, that's where they live, and some bigger fish or something eats them, so they're part of the food chain. So that's one kind, and this is microscopic, that's a micrograph. Okay, but we also have some examples of roundworms that are parasitic, so I'm going to show you a couple. These ones on the left are pinworms, and so these are millimeters here, so they're not very big. You can see them with your eyeball, but they're not very big, and they come up through your feet if you're walking barefoot, and maybe in farming areas or things like that, that you might get it there if you're walking outside barefoot. You don't usually see them in the city. Okay, and then hookworms, you can see, have a little hook on the end. Both of these are parasitic, examples of parasitic roundworms. And then a couple others that maybe you're familiar with. If you have a pet and you give your pet heartworm medication, heartworms are roundworms. And this shows you what happens if they infect your pet's heart. Why it's bad is they can fill up the heart and it's not going to be able to pump and move blood around, and that's what would cause the animal to die. So if your pet is always inside and never goes outside, you may not have to worry about that so much, but if you have a pet that goes outside regularly, this might be something that you want to get from your vet to have as a preventative. And we have at school, we have a model of an actual heart with the roundworms, so you can kind of see what happens to a heart with those roundworms in it. And then this one, nematode is just the scientific name for roundworms. And maybe you've heard of elephantiasis before, but it is caused by a parasitic roundworm. And the reason this happens, this is over accumulation of fluid, and so these little worms get stuck in your lymph vessels, and your lymph vessels, their job is to take up extra fluid and recirculate it. But if you've got these little worms clogging up those lymph vessels, you're not going to be able to recirculate fluid, and so then you end up with a lot of swelling, which is what causes elephantiasis. So that's treatable, and again, you don't see that particular roundworm in this country as much as you see in other countries, and usually you're going to pick it up from the soil. So if you're wearing shoes, then you don't have to worry about it so much. Okay, so we did the mollusks, the soft-bodied invertebrates. We did the annelids, the segmented worms, and then we looked at the nematodes, the roundworms, and so we are up to the phylum Arthropoda. So arthro refers to joints. If you have arthritis, you have inflammation of the joints, and poda refers to foot. And so these are the jointed appendage organisms. We do have you look at this at the zoo when you go to the zoo, but they are considered the most successful animal phylum, meaning they have huge numbers, they've survived over long periods of time. So I put this one just because it's really big and easy to see the joints in the appendages of that crab. So a couple of other characteristics that we see in all of the arthropods, they will have an exoskeleton. So we haven't really talked about an exoskeleton yet, but exo means on the outside. Skeleton, of course, gives structure. And it's made of chitin, which is a carbohydrate. Remember where else we've talked about that? Chitin is found in the cell walls of fungi, okay? Most of your arthropods are going to have segmentation. So if you look at this praying mantis here, he's got a head, he's got a thorax, he's got an abdomen. They all look a little bit different. The same thing with the scorpion, which you can see part of here. That's in the arthropod phylum. All of them will have sensory structures, so they have pretty advanced cephalization. So they have eyes, and they have antennae, and they have mouth parts, and all kinds of things on the front end of the body. I have a cat looking over my shoulder right now. They have a brain, so they have a lot of nervous tissue at the front end, and then they have a ventral nerve cord. We'll talk about this a little bit more in the nervous system and when we do the pig dissection and stuff, but ventral means the belly side. So it's on their belly side. Our nerve cord, our spinal cord, is on the dorsal side, which is on our back. So they have the nervous system located in a different area of the body than we do, and we do see that they take a little step back here because they have open circulation. Okay. This is where we see, not in all of them, but we see metamorphosis. So remember, that would be incomplete development, where the larval stage looks completely different from the adult stage. So I just put a couple of pictures here of, in this case, this is the caterpillar, this is the pupa, and then the moth that comes from that. So it goes through quite a metamorphosis as it finishes its development. And so again, here with arthropods, we're going to look at some classes just because there are pretty big differences between these different kinds of arthropods. So you've probably heard of arachnids. Maybe you've watched the movie Arachnophobia, so that has to do with spiders. Crustaceans like shrimp and lobster and things like that. Millipedes and centipedes. You may have millipedes crawling around in your house from time to time or in your backyard. And then insects. I'm sure you've heard of insects. So these are all classes within this group of organisms that has jointed appendages. So your author does talk a little bit about mouth parts here for the arthropods. I put the pictures because they're interesting, but also to let you know that I'm not going to be that specific. So one of the ways these organisms are classified is by what kind of mouth parts they have. And so these you're going to see in insects, and these you're going to see in the spiders. Okay?